Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island.
In the fall of 1962, on October 16th, the most dangerous period of the Cuban Missile Crisis began, and at the center were the world's two largest powers at the time, fighting over the use of Russian nuclear warheads in Cuba.
The Cold War began in 1945 with the Soviet Union taking over Eastern Bloc and the U.S. challenging the Soviet Union. The Berlin blockade was the first major crisis. The U.S. tried to stop the spread of communism, but the Soviet Union kept coming forth. Since the U.S. was a capitalist country, the USSR did not like the United States.
The first 17 years of the Cold War went without any major conflicts between the United States and the Soviet Union. This all changed on October 16, 1962, when an American U-2 spy plane discovered a Soviet missile base on Cuba, who, under the command of Fidel Castro, ended relations with the United States and sided with the Soviet Union. The U.S. tried many times to relieve Castro from power, and the most famous was the Bay of Pigs disaster in April of 1960. The plan was not actually Kennedy's idea, but it was Lyndon B. Johnson who came up with the idea, and after he left office, it was passed down to Kennedy, who reduced the amount of U.S. forces to assist the Cuban exiles who were fighting to kill communism in Cuba. Kennedy, who originally wanted to scrap the idea, was forced to accept it after the pressing of his staff. Cuba gave the Soviets and their leader Nikita Khrushchev an ally close to American borders in a perfect place to place a missile base.
On the 18th of October, Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko meets with President Kennedy and tells him that the Soviet aid is just for defense and not a threat to the U.S. Kennedy tells Gromyko that if offensive weapons are put in Cuba, gravest consequences will occur. On October 19th, while the president is on a campaign trip to Illinois and Ohio, Kennedy's advisors discuss the course of action. On October 20th, President Kennedy fakes a cold so that he may return to Washington to discuss the matters with his advisors without public suspicion. During the meeting, plans are drawn using the Navy to start a quarantine. On October 21st, it is decided that an airstrike on the high bases could be used, but 100% destruction of the missiles was not guaranteed. On October 22nd, Kennedy phones former presidents and executives and tells them that they will be meeting daily to discuss the crisis. Before President Kennedy's address, he phones Nikita Khrushchev and tells him that no sane man would deliberately start a war in the time of nuclear missiles. During the address, Kennedy reveals evidence of missiles in Cuba and says he established a naval quarantine around the island.
On October 23rd, United States UN Ambassador Aldine Stevenson brings the Soviet missile situation to the UN in a rather harsh manner.
Zorin deny that the USSR has placed and is placing medium and intermediate range missiles and sites in Cuba. Yes or no? Don't wait for the translation, yes or no. Я не нахожусь.
I am not in an American courtroom, sir, and therefore I do not wish to answer a question that is put to me in the fashion in which a prosecutor does.
Around Cuba, the U.S. quarantine moves into place. This stops Soviet subs, oil tankers, and military supplies from reaching the island. On October 24th brings Khrushchev's response to Kennedy's address with this letter. You, Mr. President, are not declaring a quarantine, but rather are setting forth an ultimatum and threatening that if we do not give in to your demands, you will use force. Consider what you are saying. And you want to persuade me to agree to this? What would it mean to me to agree to these demands? It would mean guiding oneself in one's relations with other countries not by reason, but by submitting to arbitrariness. You are no longer appealing to reason, but wish to intimidate us. On October 25th, President Kennedy, knowing that some of the missiles in Cuba are ready to be used against the U.S., writes a letter in response to Khrushchev, urging him to shut down the missile sites in Cuba. Meanwhile, at the quarantine, the only ships allowed through the U.S. blockade are oil freighters. On October 26th, Khrushchev writes a letter back to Kennedy with the same demands, agreeing to remove the missiles only if the quarantine is lifted and the U.S. will not invade Cuba. On the 27th, the second set of more strict terms from the Soviets arrived, the removal of U.S. missiles from Turkey. Over Cuba, an American U-2 was shot down, killing Major Anderson, who took the first photos of the missiles in Cuba. Many on Kennedy's staff are outraged and want the terms of the letter denied, but Kennedy believes it is a mistake and plans to think about the terms. Later that night, the U.S. sent a letter back to the Soviet Union saying they will agree to the terms, but the missiles in Turkey will be removed without public notice. On October 28th, the Soviets agreed to the terms after 23 nerve-wracking hours. With the terms, the United States looked like the winners because of the classified removal of the missiles in Turkey.
Oh, crap.
The world was left in peace after swift actions by John F. Kennedy, which prevented a nuclear holocaust much like the one in the last Babylon. But what would have happened if Kennedy hadn't waited to show that the U.S. knew about the missiles? What if he hadn't agreed to those terms because of the U-2 was shot down? This is what might have happened. The U.S. would have retaliated and sent missile strikes to destroy all the missile bases in Cuba. The one problem with that would have been that not all the bases would have been destroyed, and the Soviet Union would have sent a nuclear missile of their own in counterattack, which would have destroyed all the major U.S. cities in the United States. This would have caused a full-fledged nuclear war between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, which would have caused every other country in the world to either be involved or destroyed. Any survivors would have had to revert back to caveman habits because the world would have been left a desolate, radioactive place. Thankfully, President Kennedy didn't react hostily, and an early decision may have saved the world.
The Bay of Pigs disaster may have been a blessing in disguise for the world because if the United States went in with full force as originally planned, the Soviets may have sent more than missile bases in Cuba. They may have tried to invade the U.S. as well. Waiting to let the world know about the missiles in Cuba gave Kennedy ample time to discuss and select the correct path of action, which led towards peace, not war. His ability to see reason when the U-2 was shot down let him agree to come up with a treaty that just might have saved the world. His leadership in the Cuban Missile Crisis is largely what he is known for today, and thank goodness for us that it was.
Always watching. No. What are you?
So they President, I work up to go king, one side of paper. Looking up a power day, would you looking up a power day? King President, where is the man? King President. Look at me down. It's your time, baby, it's alright, baby, it's alright, alright.
In the fall of you know, bull crap. Done with this.